Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in. Today we're going to take a D9 that happens to have an older firmware version, and we're going to update the firmware both on the LCD and on the motherboard, and then we're going to go through the new initial leveling process. So to update the firmwares, we're going to need a few tools. We have to take off the bottom cover underneath here to access the back of the screen, in which we're going to place up to an 8 gig micro SD card. You really only need under a gig or so to fit the firmware on there. And that firmware you're going to get from Wanhao's website. When you're downloading the firmware for the LCD, make sure you're getting the appropriate firmware for the LCD that is matched to the version of the firmware that you're going to use for the board. So in this case, we're using the version 0.161 LCD firmware for the newest board firmware as of the date of this recording. That may change in the future, so check out their site and make sure you're getting the appropriate matched pair. We've got the Allen keys to remove the feet and the screws from this bottom panel, and I've got a caliper here. We're going to use this to make sure that our X gantry here, our X axis, is level. When I say level, I mean that it's equidistant from the side rails on both sides so that it's not, crooked like this or something exaggerated like that. Once we're done that, we will go through the auto bed leveling routine, which is now mesh bed level, and actually works much better than previous versions where many people ended up with the nozzle ramming into the bed. So let's get started. We're going to turn this printer on its side and start taking the bottom panel off. All right, we've flipped the station around here a little bit, and we've got 6 small screws here, and there are 2 in the feet, 1 in each foot, that are much larger in size. So we've got 2 different Allen keys for this. Let's just start unscrewing each of these. Now that we've got all those screws out, open this slowly. You're going to have a very short cable leading to the exhaust or intake fan on the bottom panel here, and it's hot glued to the connector on the board. So using something sharp, a screwdriver would work, or needle nose pliers is probably safer. Peel off the hot glue. Here we go. And the connector came out with it. And in my case, I'm just going to remove the glue entirely. Good enough. Okay. So with the panel off, we've got obviously the power supply. In this case, it's a Meanwell power supply, so that's nice to see. And then we have the main board, motherboard, whatever you want to call it. Typical 8-bit Arduino-based board. And just remember that either of these, it doesn't particularly matter. These are 24 volt out for that fan, so plug it back in there when we're done. In the back here, you've got the screen. This is the LCD board. And there will be a micro SD slot up here. There we go. Here. Get my hands out of the way. So there's a micro SD slot on the top side there, closest to the power supply, right here. So that's where we're going to put in our micro SD card. When you downloaded the LCD firmware, there's going to be a folder called dwin_set. That entire folder, the folder itself, gets placed on the root of your SD card. So format your SD card as FAT32, use 4096 as the sector size, and then drop that dwin_set folder right on the root here. So when you plug this into your laptop, all you should see is one folder on it called dwin_set. Everything will be in there. We've already done that here. So place that card in with the pins on the card facing away from you. And click it down. It's one of those spring-loaded slots. And then we can turn this over, turn it on, and we'll see what happens on the LCD screen. So when you're flipping it back over, be careful because we took the legs off. There's no panel or legs on the bottom there. There's also no fan ventilating that, but it's not going to be a problem. We're not going to have this on for very long, and we're not printing with it. We've reconnected the power to the side there. Turn the switch on, and you should see the screen say that it's flashing. It will be going through all of the images that are on the SD card that it's going to load into the firmware on the screen. And when it's done, it will say flash success or flash complete at the top. We'll just wait for that to finish. So at the top it says SD card process end after it's flashed through all of the image files that we just saw there a second ago. So we're done flashing the LCD. I'll just turn this off, pull out the power, and I'll flip it back over and we'll button up the bottom because we're done with that. And then next we're going to flash the mainboard firmware, which we will do through the USB cable. Just before we button this back up, I'm going to make a mention of a couple things. It's a good idea to take a look in here and make sure that all these cables are secure. The reason I say that, I've actually repaired a couple D9s where the bed heater cable has come loose and the bed wasn't heating as a result. And also make sure there isn't any kind of white residue that would indicate that it's arcing or something. The rest of these are all pretty secure, but the only issue I've seen is with the power cables for the bed. Those look good in this case. I've checked that they're tight, and so now we'll just reverse what we did earlier. Remember, before you bolt the bottom back onto the printer, make sure you've removed the micro SD card out of the screen. So now at this point, we're going to download the mainboard firmware, which in Wanhao's case, right now, they only provide it in hex file format. So you don't get the source, but it's pre-compiled. And I find the easiest way to load that is using a software called Xloader. So we'll link to the Wanhao page down below for the D9 300, as well as directly to the Xloader software that we're going to use in the screencast in a moment to load that firmware on here. So we'll get the cable that came with this printer and we'll be back in a second. So I've gone to Wanhao's site, and here you can see what I was describing earlier, that there are the different firmwares for the D9. They're all mixed in here, so be careful. Some are for the D9 400, 500, 300. Here's the newest for the 300, version 0.164B. And as you can see, the firmware hasn't changed since 0.161. So even back here, it was still 0.161. So that's what we just flashed. We're going to download the hex file here. You don't need to create an account to download this. Just skip that. Okay. I'm just going to save this on my desktop. Okay. So now I've already downloaded Xloader. It's a simple zip file, I believe, so we'll extract that to a folder. You have these files. Just run xloader.exe. And at this point, I'm going to plug the USB cable from my laptop into the printer. Choose the COM port that's listed here, in this case COM4. And it is an Arduino Mega 2560 based board. And here we will choose that hex file that is on our desktop. And then hit upload. There we go. It takes about a solid minute to upload, so don't be alarmed. You won't see anything really happening. The printer screen, you'll see it reboot itself when the upload is complete. And we can just close all of this. So before we go back to the printer, I'm just going to check something here. I've loaded up the Arduino IDE, and I'm going to choose our COM port here, COM4. And I'm just going to bring up the serial monitor. So here we can see it was compiled on July 26, 2018. So when I open a printer out of the box, or if I already have a printer, I could just connect to it this way and see when the firmware that's on my printer was compiled. Unfortunately, they haven't filled out the config that shows you like what version it is and who the editor was, so that we could more accurately track versions as Wanhao uses them to what's on our printer. But as of the recording now, the newest firmware that we just flashed was July 26th. So if we saw that initially on say a new unboxing, there would be no reason for us at this point to flash the firmware. So let's close that and return back to the printer. So before we turn it on and do our first auto leveling and set the Z offset for the sensor, Wanhao has now included, at least on this batch, these stickers that kind of give you a leveling line. And what this is to make sure that your x-axis here isn't kind of cockeyed. So because they've just used the cylindrical connection point between the 2020 rail and this back brace, there's nothing stopping it from tipping very easily like that, whereas if they had kind of two connection points, it wouldn't be allowed to teeter. So we want to make sure that this is level on both sides. So I'll bring this down until the bottom of this bracket is in line with the leveling line, right there, and then we'll hold this one stationary because it's in line, and I'm just going to rotate the other one. There we go. So that should be level. We could always take our caliper and measure between two stationary points. So I can measure between the top of this bracket here and here, or better would be maybe the frame and here, and see how high that is and compare it to the other side. But this should honestly be close enough, at least for this video. So let's flip this around. So according to Wanhao, this sensor here should be 26 millimeters or so from the tip of the sensor to the bottom of this plate. It actually doesn't matter if it's even further down, as long as it's not further up. And as long as it's not so far down that it's below the nozzle, obviously that's going to hit your print. In our case, we're at about 24 3/4, 24.75 millimeters. So what we're going to do is we're going to loosen this nut on the top and lower the sensor down. Now, depending on which iteration of this printer you have, you may have a nut on the top and bottom that are kind of pinching the bracket. In this case, we only have a nut on top, and I believe the bracket itself is threaded. Yeah. So it's probably going to be easiest for us to rotate the sensor if we unplug it from the top. And let's bring it down. Double check. Okay. So now we're 26.15, and that should be fine. Put it a little bit further down and then tighten this back up. You don't need to go too tight with that, just enough that the sensor is not going to wiggle around or rotate free or anything, just to keep a little bit of tension. Or you may have that second nut on the bottom that you'd want to tighten both of them against this bracket. It's much easier to adjust the one with the threaded bracket for sure. Okay, now that that is done, we're ready to do our first time homing. So let's turn on the printer, and as is good practice after you flash a firmware, we're just going to reset to factory defaults. We'll do that under settings. There's factory reset, just say yes. Now let's go back and we'll go to level. Now, it's probably best to do this with your bed hot. Bed and nozzle hot would be preferable, I think. Metals expand when they're heated, and we don't want to be, detecting how close the nozzle is to the bed when things are cold, and then when they're heated up, it's going to be much closer. In the interest of time, we're not going to heat it up. I'm just going to do level. So now the screen tells us to grab a card, a piece of paper. So I use kind of your typical printer paper, and we're going to do the standard drag test between the nozzle and the bed. And we're using this process to set the Z offset. So that's to tell the firmware what the difference is between where the nozzle hits the bed and where the sensor senses the bed. So when it senses that there's bed, that's not actually 0, it needs to go down a little bit further. So that offset is the amount that we're setting right now. So now that we've got our paper, hit next. It's going to home all axes, and then it'll move the nozzle to the middle of the bed, and it will go to what it thinks is Z equals 0. So as we can see, there's tons of space. So on the screen right now, it says that there's a 0mm offset. So obviously we need more than a 0mm offset because there is a height difference between where it's sensing and where the nozzle tip is. So if we hit 0.1 millimeters, we don't want to move in 1 millimeter increments necessarily. We're going to bring the Z down 0.1 at a time and just continually check for the drag on the paper. Okay, so now I've got kind of my normal amount of drag. If I go 0.1 further to 0.9, it's just too much. If I go down to minus 0.8 in my case, it's perfect. So now that I found the right Z offset, I'll hit next. That will save that to the EEPROM, and then it will go through an auto bed leveling routine. Okay, so now at this point, we should be ready to print and we should have a very good first layer. So having done all that, there are definitely some quality issues or shipping damage that can affect your ability to properly level the bed. So let's go over a couple of those possibilities. The easiest one to see visually is the wheels. So many printers have come straight out of the box, and in some cases, maybe they were damaged in shipping. In others, it's just happened over time and use. But the wheels on the bed here, the bearings will actually pop right out of the wheels. So there's either been some compression on the bed, putting forces this direction on the wheels, in which case I'd probably suggest just replacing the entire wheel and bearing assembly. If I remember correctly, I don't believe these wheels have a ridge in the middle to stop the two half bearings from kind of sloshing around or sliding completely out one side or the other of the wheel. So that would be preferable. Also make sure that there's adequate tension on these two little set screws on either side. This wheel, unlike the eccentric nut style, this wheel is spring loaded. So that little bracket that it's connected to has some springs. And you want to make sure that there's adequate tension so that, when you roll any one wheel, it rolls the bed. This one might be a little bit loose, so this could probably use a little bit more tension, but it's really not that bad. They're all rotating. And Wanhao does grease this rail up quite a bit, and I'm sure I know why. I've had my D9 for quite a while now, and I've seen this also on other people's printers. The rails, these 2020 rails, the coating on them will actually flake off, or I've even seen little chips and chunks in them. If that happens, you're probably best to grab a 2020 rail, cut it to size, and replace them entirely, because it's just not going to roll smoothly on there. And you should also make sure that these rails are parallel to each other. So some of the beds, you'll hear kind of a crunching or a crinkling as it moves back and forth. Of course, this one doesn't have it. And that seems to be those springs that I mentioned, kind of compressing and expanding. I've seen where the rails are further out at the front or further out at the back, so they're not parallel with each other. Easy way to check that, throw a caliper on them between the two front points, check your value. I think this one's 230 or so, or sorry, 160. And then check the back. Yep, it's about the same. It's within a millimeter, which is more than acceptable. I guess you could spend a little bit of time making sure that those are even more square than that. But this one, like I said, doesn't have any kind of tracking issues. The wheels have no kind of flat spots. If you feel it kind of, if you feel little detents as you move it back and forth, like duh, 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 it'll happen once every rotation of a wheel, usually. And that can indicate that the wheels are just too tight, so you've tightened those set screws and it's putting too much pressure on there, or that you've got a bad bearing or a flat spot in a wheel. Again, it's easiest just to swap the wheel out once you figured out which wheel it is. Anyway, hopefully you found that informative and useful. Remember to like and subscribe, and leave a comment down below. Let us know what else you'd like to see on a printer like the D9 or any of the other printers we've featured. Thanks for watching.